So I'd like to welcome my panelists to a special Seeking Delphi web panel, Aftershock and the Legacy of Alvin Toffler. My name is Mark Sackler. I'm the host and producer of Seeking Delphi. I'm a member of the Association of Professional Futurists. As are both of my panelists, unfortunately, we had hoped to have three panelists: Cindy Fruin, the former chair of the Association of Professional Futurists, urban architect and futurist, was unable to be with us due to a last-minute family matter, so we wish her the best with that. But we will discuss a point from her essay in Aftershock. Now, the book Aftershock, if I can get this up here, and show that. It came out about a week ago Tuesday. 50 of the world's foremost futurists reflect on 50 years of future shock and look ahead to the next 50 years. With that, as I speak to you from my home office in Woodbridge, Connecticut, we're going to discuss some points from the essays of the three of these individuals: Cindy's, even though she's not here, and my two fellow APF members, Andrew Curry and Jerome Glen, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and we'll start going out across the pond to the London area. And Andrew Curry. Andrew.
Hi, Mark. It's very good to be here and very good to be talking about Alvin Toffler. I'm Andrew Curry. I've been a futurist since I stumbled into the field about 20 years ago. Been working as a futures practitioner for most of that 20 years, but also writing about futures issues. I was one of the first authors on the Three Horizons paper back in 2008, and obviously that's taken off wildly since then. So obviously I was pleased to accept John Schroeter's invitation as the editor of the book to write the essay, and I'm pleased to be here talking with you today.
That's great. And of course, Jerome Glen in Washington, D.C., from the Millennium Project. Jerry.
Hi, I've been involved in futures research for about 45 years. I've worked for right-wing think tanks, left-wing think tanks, up-wing think tanks, down-wing think tanks, and finally got around to making a general think tank on the global future called the Millennium Project, which I've been running for about the last 20 some odd years.
That's great. So let's begin now to talk about some of the essays in this book and the 50-year legacy of Alvin Toffler. I personally probably was started on my long road. I didn't formally become a futurist in a serious sense until my retirement from my day job, but I think I've always been interested in the future, and it was reading Future Shock back in the early 70s, shortly after I was out of college. So let's revisit some of the things Toffler talked about and some of the things in the essay. So unfortunately, Cindy's not here with us today, but I'd certainly like to talk about her her essay. Now, she talks about what Toffler got right and wrong in terms of the urban future, but she makes a point that we can all relate to when she says that Toffler felt that future shock was going to create chaos because people would not be able to adapt to the rapid pace of change. She said, in fact, she thinks that individuals have adapted pretty well in that you see things like she sees her 90-year-old mother using the Amazon Echo to ask Alexa to stream excuse me, to stream Doris Day songs and the like. That's perhaps true, but really, when I look at it, Toffler said even then that there were those people that were embracing the future, that were living there, and those people that weren't living in that future yet. And I think today we're seeing not so much future shock as maybe future aversion. There's a large portion of society that's trying to prevent the future, maybe even to push back from it. Trump, Brexit, populist right-wing movements around the world. So I'm curious to know how you guys would like to react. Would either one of you want to comment to begin with on that?
I'm very happy to do that. I think one of the things that's interesting about Future Shock, you know, it's published in 1970. I think if we were sitting here in the early 1970s and thinking about which futures book from that period was still going to be talked about in 50 years' time, I don't think we'd actually be talking about Future Shock. This might sound odd, but if you go back to that period, Herman Kahn was a kind of popular celebrity at the time. His books on the world in 2000 had been a franchise. They had been published in lots and lots of different languages, lots and lots of different countries. And I'm kind of struck here, and I'm hoping that Jerry has a view on this, but I'm struck here that these days Herman Kahn's really a bit of a historical curiosity. He has his place in the history of futures, but he's a bit of a curiosity. His books are almost all out of print, whereas Alvin Toffler's book, obviously mostly co-written with his wife Heidi, whether she got a credit or not on the books, is still being talked about, is still in print. So there was obviously something that he caught of the moment when he wrote the Future Shock in 1970. Then obviously went on to write a whole string of other influential books.
Jerry, you have any comments on that adaptability?
Yeah. I think we got habituated. Habituation, as you know, is when you receive information and you don't respond. You just sort of nod your head and go along with it. Oh, it's version 2.0. Oh, it's version 3.0. Oh, we got another iPhone 10. Oh, we got another iPhone. I think there's an awful lot of just non-thinking habituation going on, sort of a numbness about change. So I don't think we got I don't think we got so much shocked as we got habituated. I mean, obviously, many people like us get a kick out of all this change and don't have a problem. And some people are avoiding it, as you pointed out. But I think the bulk just simply nods their head and goes along with stuff. Habituation is more my concern. And by the way, on Herman becoming a novelty, I think it ought to be remembered that out of Herman came the concept of escalation. Major concept in military analysis, to this day is used. Scenarios came from him as well, even though people do scenario planning in a very superficial way, unlike the original idea of scenarios that listed cause and effect links that illustrated decisions along the way of the narrative. Now we just do endpoints of, in these 4 different futures, what do you do? So I would say I would not relegate him to a novelty. I would recommend him as a pillar upon which futurists have been feeding off of for years.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think I was just struck by the fact that almost all of Herman Kahn's books are now out of print, and
yeah,
almost all of Alvin Toffler's are still in print. That was the kind of contrast I was trying to make.
And of course, Hudson Institute, for better or worse, is still alive in Washington, D.C., which Herman would have been upset with because he didn't want people being in Washington, D.C. He thought it polluted their brain.
The other thing I was just going to say, Mark, going back to your question, is that one of the things that Toffler captures in Future Shock is just the very, it's the effect. In a sense, it's this post-60s moment where values are shifting. I mean, there's some really extreme examples which didn't happen. I think it was maybe a TWA flight where they were adapting the cuisine to particular cultural styles, and obviously, I don't think that as an innovation probably lasted very long. It probably came out of service quite fast. But nonetheless, there's a lot of the change that he's capturing is actually cultural change. And so I think one of the things he was catching was that very early moment of the long social shift that Engelhardt has made his reputation on, from modern values to post-materialist values. And he was probably catching at a time when, difficult to gauge the percentages, but maybe 5% of the population were holding post-materialist values. And obviously now in 2020, that's probably 50%. It's difficult to know the exact numbers, but it's of that order of magnitude. So I think one of the things that he was capturing was that sense of quite profound social change. And, one of the, I know it's not the job of a futurist to get things right, but it is interesting to that he was sort of brave enough to sort of, predict gay marriage and gay adoption at a point, and just around the time of the Stonewall riots, really, where, he was capturing that idea that these sort of social changes that he was picking up when he was writing Future Shock were really deep and really profound, and were going to go a long way.
Yeah, I would add on to that. To me, one of the great contributions of Toffler and Future Shock was it took the future from the province of science fiction and think tanks into the general public more than anybody else in the history of ideas.
Well, we'll actually get more into that when we get to your essay, Jerome. So I think one other thing, and it's not exactly related to Cindy's essay, but she did obviously get into sustainability and the like. And one point that he talked about that has kind of shifted substantially, uh, that Toffler talked about, was what he called the Disposable Society, as you know, throwaway stuff, the razors, plastic razors you use 3 or 4 times and throw away, obviously the disposable diapers, blah blah blah. And of course we've kind of seen a pullback from that in terms of now, because of environmental issues, trying to go to sustainability and reusing more stuff. But hasn't there kind of been a shift, that disposability, not from the material things, but maybe toward the services and the experiences, the sharing, gig economy, experience becoming more important in marketing and the like? And I just thought if you guys could maybe reflect a little bit on that.
Well, I think he captures that really well, actually. I mean, one of the curiosities about Future Shock is the environment's almost completely absent. When you look at if you look at the index, for example, environmental pollution, I think it's got mentions on 2 pages, and that's kind of it. But on the other hand, and he develops this much more in the third wave a decade later, he really captures that shift from a kind of a manufacturing-led society to a services-led society. And again, in terms of the historical moment, I think he was writing just a few years after services started for the first time to represent 50% of the American economy by value. So that shift had just gone. So again, that a lot of that flexibility around work, around a lot of that sort of soft value coming from knowledge and services. That's one of the kind of strengths of Future Shock, much more so in the third wave, but that's one of the strengths of Future Shock, that he sort of makes that sort of change visible in the same way, admittedly, that people like Daniel Bell had already been writing about a few years before him.
Jerry, anything to add on that notion?
Well, when I sort of re-skimmed, didn't read every word, but re-skimmed Future Shock before writing the article, I was really reminded by how much detail he had in there. That was chock full of stuff. I mean, yes, he got some stuff wrong. I mean, like he mentions China twice the entire book, and it's sort of tangential, so China is a major deal at the present tense. But I think that it was rich, extremely rich in ideas and thoughts. And so I recommend people read it again today.
Excellent. All right, why don't we, let's move on and talk about Andrew's essay. Now, Andrew, you had a central point that I think it would be controversy and would get pushback from a lot of the other authors in this book, that you felt that change was not accelerating, it was slowing down because of slowing population and economic growth and the nearing end of Moore's law. So before Jerry and I and maybe others jump on you for that, why don't you talk about that and defend it a little bit?
Yeah, I do feel, looking through the contributions, that I'm probably quite a long way to the end of the bell curve distribution on that view, to be honest, Mark. It's probably not a popular view, and when I'm working with clients, I often have this argument, but it's probably worth just talking about it a little bit. I'm a big fan of the Carlota Perez model of technology change, and what that does is it integrates a view of finance and economics and social issues around long waves of technology change. And without getting into the whole thing, she says, and this is a kind of a model rather than a kind of law, but she says, look, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, there's been 5, 50 or 60-year surges of technology. And there have been typically little clusters of technology which have become the dominant idea of their time. Starts with continent canals, goes through steam and railways, goes through steel and electricity, goes through oil and automobiles, and then arrives in ICT. And each of those follows an S-curve pattern. And towards the end, kind of everybody's really excited about the technology, except for the investors. I think one of the things that also happens at the end is that the technology slows down. That's what S-curves do. The technology slows down, the markets become saturated. But there's a kind of a late phase of technologies where they deepen themselves in social patterns and social habits. So if you look back to the end of the car phase, the car and oil phase, you know, business parks in Europe, out-of-town supermarkets in Europe, they didn't really come in until 1970s or so, when it's actually in the Perez model, that's actually the beginning of the ICT wave. You just start seeing the technological capacity to start the ICT wave, even though it doesn't actually accelerate for another 25 years. So what actually happens in each of these surges is they're the dominant idea. They're sort of full of, especially towards the end, they kind of, people believe that just they are the future, whatever they are. And then actually by that stage, they're already running out of steam. So, you know, if you go back to actually when Toffler was writing Aftershock, which was right at the end of Perez's car and oil surge, you know, you had lots of predictions about the car industry. You had lots of predictions about the aviation industry. And, you know, we know none of those came true, you know, that actually the car has just become a embedded, fairly functional piece of technology. So that's my model here. We're kind of we're close to the end of the ICT S-curve, and other things are slowing down as well. Demographics are slowing down. Economic growth is stagnant, and, you know, even slowing in places like China.
I have a question. When you're saying it's slowing down, are we talking about, and sorry for this little man here, my apologies, are we talking about proliferation of, like, it's been deployed in enough places in society that it's slowing down, and it's like, you know, you could say speed of penetration? Or is it about profitability, where the investors or or my apologies, where the profitability is not there? So we want to use the tech, but it doesn't make us money like it used to.
I think that's pretty much exactly right. You go through a phase where the tech just gets embedded in society, but actually you're not seeing the big surges in investment and innovation that you saw earlier on, you know. And frankly, if you look at Alphabet, you know, Google is still unable to make money. It's got, you know, Google has venture funds all over the place and nothing makes money except for advertising, you know. So that's kind of quite a good example. And, you know, you've caught it exactly. But this is the argument that you know, I'm grateful for that question, Robert, because this is the argument I have all the time, repeatedly. Sorry, I'll stop now because I've been talking too much.
Okay, well, I'm going to, before even Jerry gets in, I'm going to rebut a little bit here. So I think that, as you said, I cited in my notes to you a number of emerging technologies that it's not so much even the speed, it's the disruptiveness. There's genetic editing and longevity extension that have transhumanist overtones to them, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, laboratory grown meat, autonomous vehicles, ambient commuting and digital twins, and it goes on, and lots of venture money is going into all of these. And I would argue that it won't necessarily be the speed, as we've kind of have become much of society numb to the speed. It's the disruptiveness, and some of these have a chance, the potential to be almost more disruptive than, as disruptive or even more disruptive as anything we've seen in a long time.
Well, you know, obviously we don't know that's true or not. I think I just separate out some of the things you're talking about there, though, Mark. You know, when I'm looking at, I think you talked about lab-grown meat here. That's actually a different technology. That's not a digital technology. That might be one of the things that drives the next wave. You know, if you follow the Perez model, some point in the 2020s, we're going to see the beginnings, the very early beginnings of a new cycle of technology. And we don't actually know what that is yet. It could be something based on synthetic biology. I work with quite a lot of people who are working with digital twins in their kind of buildings or their modeling at the moment. And I agree that's quite an interesting technology, but is it truly disruptive? I'm not sure about that. You know, I'm still actually a bit skeptical about AI. You know, I still talk to quite a lot of scientists who say, Jerry's about to jump down my throat now because I've read some of his stuff on AI. But, you know, I'm still a little bit skeptical about AI because I've read quite a lot of stuff from and talked to AI scientists to say we've picked off the low-hanging fruit there, that actually the problems get harder and harder and harder as you go up, as you go into them, and that actually maybe maybe the reason we're so excited about it, it's relatively early stages on an S-curve, and it hasn't necessarily got that far to go before it starts leveling off. So you don't know. But I mean, going back to the model, what actually happens, and Robert's question was a very good one, was a lot of these things for me, like digital twins, even like facial recognition, are sort of examples of a technology that's sort of gone through its phase and has become normalized and embedded and all the rest of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's having accelerative thrust in society any longer.
And by the way, I'm going to ask we have a couple of observers. I am going to ask you to hold questions until the end from here on. Jerry, do you have anything to comment about on that before we go on to your discussing
Sure, let
your
me
essay?
count the ways. I was involved in the internet. My first email was 1973. And I was involved in the packet switching stuff, getting into third world dictatorships and things like that, when people said, look, this is just for the elites. This has got nothing to do with the general public. Well, that was pretty wrong. I mean, that was a vast majority, and even including some major futurists of the day thought it was not going to be a big deal. So I've watched a lot of nonsense. I've done this stuff for 45 years. And a couple of rules of thumb. Whatever you look at in the future, it's going to get more complex than you think. So what you're measuring isn't necessarily the same thing, like oranges turn into grapefruits, or if we measure cell phones, are we measuring calendars? Are we measuring recording devices? Are we measuring video? Well, it's all sloshed together. On the Moore's law, people have been counting out Moore's law for at least 20 to 30 years, if you go back to the literature. And what's coming up next? Cube. Because most of the chips today are flat little surfaces running around in a plane. Well, we're now making cube chips. Well, that's going to change it as well. You can now get IBM Watson it's only got five or so quantums at the moment, but it's going to it's warming up, and so that's going to change things. Quantum computing is here today, and it's going to keep growing. As another rule of thumb is that the science leads to technological applications far faster than people think. And I've watched this over a lot of years. Things happen much faster. What the confusion is, the application and acceptance of the new thing takes a lot longer than it ought to take. When the first protocols for internet were created? Late 60s. Late 1960s, and it wasn't until the 90s that people started using this stuff. So we get real slow on applications and stuff. But one of the things I would also throw in there is the mindset of the world. When we started the Millennium Project, and not that we had to do with it, but when we started the Millennium Project, a lot of futurists said you can't do global futures research. It's too complex. It's too many different ways of doing stuff. I mean, forget it. You're going to end up with general pablum. You got the communists over here at capital. You can't do it. Stop. It's dumb. Well, no one says that. Now they say we don't do it right. Well, that's fair enough. But parallel to that, the idea of the Millennium Development Goals, the idea of the world thinking together 50 years ago was an impossible thought, let alone 25 years ago. So the idea of a global consciousness, global awareness, giving a damn about the Congo and so forth, things like this are really new in the game. When the Americans had a black president, at that time he was saying, well, I'm not so sure about the gays in this and gays in that. Well, now we've got the leading candidate in the United States as a gay. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of change. So it's not just tech change. There's also social consciousness change. So yes, I would disagree.
Well, I think, Jerry, you just made my point about the S-curve, because obviously, 1969 was
but they keep doing new curves. That's what the envelopes are. Well, you keep going. So like your next big deal, as you're starting to point out, synthetic biology. And by the way, when we did this work technology study, and I had to read everybody else's reports, not one report had the word synthetic biology in it, not one. And yet that could be the next big thing after the steam engine, for God's sake.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm just, my point is not that change. My point is that the digital wave is slowing down.
Well,
sure. But
it's become normalized. I mean, we have so many new innovations every year in these things. We're not counting them anymore as new innovations.
I might add, we often don't know how to use them.
Let me just go on.
That's right. That's right. We don't use them all. That's correct.
Yeah, but let me just, the other thing that happens at the end of the S-curve is that the external costs of the technology surge that you've just been through are caught up with by society. So at the end of the 60s, you suddenly saw parking legislation, drunk driving legislation, controls on emissions, because actually eventually one of Robert Moses' motorway plans through New York finally got stopped by Jane Jacobs. That's the kind of thing that happens in the last 10 years of the cycle. And what we're seeing now in the digital phase is a whole lot of pushback from regulators, from politicians, from social activist groups, so that actually that these things need restrictions, and that slows things down as well. So I'm just trying to make the
Right.
point that some
Well, the phenomena,
change does go through patterns.
yeah, but the phenomena of the smart city is just taking off.
And
And
that's
that's going to be a whole new bell curve for you to look at.
Well, I'm not a fan of the smart city idea.
Well, whether you're a fan or not, you can't run Moscow without artificial intelligence. You can't run Cairo without artificial intelligence. These cities are getting so large and so complex. You can't run them without artificial intelligence, because humans can't keep track of all this stuff. Look at the political leadership around the world. It's sort of stupid, because the things are getting way beyond the politicians' ability to handle it.
And I live in a city where all the entire subway system, metro system, tube system is driven off digital control.
Right.
But that's about deepening habit. That's about deepening habit. It's not about accelerating change, I'd say.
And Andrew, you're lucky that Cindy's not here to tell you what she thinks of your statement that you don't believe in the smart cities, because I'm sure she'd have something to say about that.
Well, actually, I think she would, but I'm not sure she'd be completely hostile. One of the things that I took from Cindy's essay, which was around the fact that change was layered. There's a lot of in Cindy's essay about the way in which in India there are still, the cows, which are a sacred animal, are still respected. They're possibly not on the motorways. And I think she was trying to make a point, maybe sort of reflecting some of Jim Data's story, that the future is not all about the new things. That actually, we see the things from the past coming back through into everyday life as well. If we're talking about cities, the rise of the bicycle, even in places like American cities where I wouldn't really have expected it 30 years ago, is a kind of classic example of a bit of technology from the past.
But they're battery driven. But they're a new kind of bicycles. They're not just bicycles. They're electric motors.
Jerry, you're going to see novelty everywhere.
No, I'm just trying to balance off one side. If somebody else was like, when let's say the other stuff on the singularity folks, I lecture at singularity sometimes, and I'm giving up the other side sometimes. So it depends. It's like a bedside manner. If the patient's too confident, you tell them, hey, take your medicine. If they're a nervous wreck, say, hey, you can get solved. Right?
Yeah, I'm going to give this back to Mark and let him.
We could probably use up the whole hour and more arguing on this, but I'd like to go on to Jerome's essay, which centered on the notion that Alvin Toffler's Future Shock made life easier for futurists. He made futurist thinking a legitimate thing, and that's true, I guess, for serious professional futurists. But on the other hand, society as a whole, and that book is probably what started me on the road to being a futurist, but I also still lament the short-term orientation of much of society. Yes, certain individuals, certain companies do take a very long view, but governments and a lot of people do not. Short-term thinking still pervades our society. And go take a look at what's on YouTube. Those funny cat videos might have 2 million hits, and I'm lucky to get 3,000 or 4,000 on an interesting podcast dealing with the future. So it's still a hard sell to a broader audience. So where do you stand on those two issues? Yes, he made the life easier, but I don't think it's still where it should be.
Well, of course, we're never going to be satisfied. Socrates made that point a long time ago. But it's much different today. I mean, back in the 70s, I could have put most of the futures in my living room. Now it's become chic. It's cool to say you're a futurist, and what they really mean is that they know the future of 3D printing, or they knew the future of AI or something. but they're not really general futurists in the sense of looking at across a bunch of different areas. But I would say that the futures phenomena has grown tremendously since then. I mean, even in Iran, there are 3 universities where you can get a PhD in futures research. That's an amazing phenomenon, right? So yes, it's not going as far. I mean, anybody's read my stuff, one of my opening comments or close to opening comments is short-term economic selfish decision-making is killing us in a whole lot of areas. Yes, I mean, I'm beating up on that issue every day, but it's much change has occurred. Increasingly, you hear people say, take the long view, or it's a long consequence. Even in Congress, not that they do it, but at least they start to say it, you know, whereas before they didn't even say it, you know. There's now a movement to put OTA back in business again, and it may happen in the next administration. So I would say that one, Toffler did make it easier for us, because if I'm somewhere and someone says, well, how do you do this future stuff? What do you look at? The future's not here. If it's not here, how can you study it, you know? And I'd say, you heard that book called Future Shock? And they say, yeah. I said, that's what I'm talking about. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. So how do you do that? That's good. So it made it easier, because we could just point at the book and save ourselves hours of conversation. So I would say that's one of the reasons it made it easier. And I'd also say, as I said a little bit earlier, is that it moved it out of the control of just science fiction writers and think tank elites into the general public more than anybody in history. And I believe that's absolutely a true statement. And the other part is, future, we're all jealous. When he came out, I mean, he's a better writer than we are. He didn't have that many ideas, by the way. A lot of his stuff was given to him by everybody, right? But he's a better writer, and we're just jealous of that. Yeah. So that's I guess my main point is.
So I have, you know, I started my career as a journalist, and when you read Toffler's writing, it is electric. You know, I think
yes.
one of the reasons the book had the impact is, I mean, actually it tails off a bit, but you know, the first 30 pages, you know, it's like reading, you know, it's almost as dynamically written as something like the Communist Manifesto. You know, whether or not you agree with what he's saying on the page, right, the energy of the writing just pulls you away, you know.
Yeah.
And I think, going back to your original question here, Mark, a couple of observations. You know, one is, you know, if you go back to the history of futures, he was writing before any of the corporates had sort of really come out and started doing futures. So he's writing, you know, before Shell started their futures program, you know, long before people like the Global Business Network had come into operation, just a little bit after Mankind 2000 in Oslo, which was almost the first sort of academic gathering. And it wasn't, you know, that was pretty much every serious futurist in the world in kind of one conference in Oslo for 3 or 4 days. And I think my other observation would be, you know, historically, it's always been the case that the cat gifts win. You know, I mean, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when H.G. Wells was writing some great stuff about the need for futurists, for the need for futures and all the rest of it, the Daily Mail was actually selling millions and millions of copies, selling on sensational crime stories and sort of murders in London. So you know, I think it's always the case that the whatever the contemporary equivalent of the cat videos on YouTube are going to be out selling serious thinking about the future. But nonetheless, he did, as Jerry says, kind of make it normal, if you like, open it up, make it accessible. And some of that was just down to just the power of the writing.
That's right.
I'm going to observe also that if you look at and I'm thinking of this because you mentioned one of our APF colleagues who's in Singapore, that it seems to be, in terms of focused thinking about the future by a government, the 3 most forward-looking places in the world seem to be Singapore, Dubai, and Estonia. They're all small and much less heterogeneous.
I'd throw in South Korea. I'd add South Korea.
Yeah.
And again, though, smaller and more heterogeneous than say the U.S., Western Europe, and so and just not as big and complex in their societies. I'm curious to know what you might make of that fact.
Well, I'd add I'd add Finland to that list as well. Mark,
Yes,
feel
fair
free.
enough.
And it,
They're
well, no,
small,
and,
but they're a smaller population, 5 million,
yeah,
6
yeah,
million.
absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, lots of trees, but
Yeah.
but I think there's another case in point. You know,
Yeah.
they're another smallish, relatively heterogeneous population,
Right.
relatively culturally coherent. I think probably what I make of that is there's quite a lot of work which says that small countries are better connected internally. Actually, one of the things that the internet has done is allowed things which are already sort of lots of pieces loosely connected to be much more effective than things which have got more pieces with much more different levels of connectivity. So I think they, you know, actually they've been the beneficiaries of a lot of the digital boom in being able to move faster because they're better connected internally.
Well, the reason I brought up Korea, aside from them probably being a major culture that has added futures thinking to be normal in it, they're a larger population. I mean, I've forgotten what the population is, 40,000 or 40 million or whatever.
40 million, yeah.
So it's a larger country. As a matter of fact, there's a story there that is never going to probably get published. Herman Kahn was with the dictator, not a cool cat, but the dictator of the country, for off and on for over a 10-year period. And so the great economic miracle turns out to be not just this. He was, by the way, the school teacher. He was an elementary school teacher before he became president. But the people who didn't like that dictator don't want to be reminded that he caused an economic miracle by economist measures in the world as the most extraordinary change in a short period of time. And the people who did like him don't want to know that a futurist had anything to do with it. And I bring this up because there's a lesson here. Too often, people bring in the futurists to give a lecture, give a speech, write a report, and leave town. And there may be an impact and there may not be an impact. What I give credit to the South Park Chung-hee about is that what he did is he didn't have that with Herman. What he did is they sort of like hung out together for several days. Let your imagination go, and they hung out together. And then 3 months later or so, he'd come back, and they had hung out and get drunk and screw around and so forth, literally. And this went on for a long period of time. So the guy got it in his bones, because when you get a phone call and some decision's got to be made right then and there, no one's going to go through your briefing book and read it's got to be in their being. And that was the smartest use of a futurist I've ever seen. Now,
well, actually, sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that, because, you know, obviously South Korea, Singapore, even Finland, they're all countries that have gone from really kind of relatively middle-income countries, relatively dependent on kind of primary goods production, or in Singapore's case, not really dependent very much at all, to being high-income countries over the courses of about two generations. Yeah. So I don't know whether the futurists can make a claim for success there, but it seems to be an interesting connection. Well, causality is hard to get to.
Well, there is, of course. David Hume said it was nonsense. But anyway, Finland's is another one to underline there. You know, Finland made money as a middleman between Moscow and Washington and the rest of the world. They even had a cabinet position on that role. And so when the Soviet Union went down, so did Finland's economy go down. They created, a couple of years later, they created the Committee for the Future, not to allocate money, but to allocate knowledge and decision requirements. And so it became non-political, which is hard to do in a political environment. And I've dealt with them a number of times. I said, by the way, is it fair to say that you were instrumental in changing the self-identity of Finland into a new age, or a new Finland, so to speak? And they say, yeah, that was the purpose of the committee. And it's still going on today. And not a single country has duplicated it yet. Pisses me off. It's a good model, and it should be duplicated. And so there are Congress of the Future in Peru and other countries, but they're these one-shot deals. There's no continuity in there. And Finland should take it on as a foreign policy objective to get the world to put those things in every parliament in the world.
Well, I'll recount my experience with government, which, a small population, but a diverse one right here in Connecticut 20 years ago. I worked with my local state senator to help push through a rider under the budget bill that created a 21st century action plan commission, a kind of a commission on the future for the state of Connecticut. We had 2 meetings, and that was the end of it. We couldn't raise anybody. One party wouldn't appoint their members, and even the state senator who helped me said, well, the economy's better now. Do we really need it? Like, really, there's not going to be another recession in the next 100 years. So this again is the short-term thinking, and it's maybe more pervasive in the Western democracies than perhaps in Asia, where you've got Singapore and South Korea. I don't know, but a very frustrating point, and it just and reinforced my feelings. At any rate, one last point to discuss here. We'll see if we have any questions before we wrap this up, and that is just overall impressions of the book. There's so many different points of view that express the diversity that is the futurist community out there right now. So I'm curious your overall point of view on Aftershock, and is there any particular essay besides your own that kind of caught your eye? Either you want to start on that?
Oh, you're asking me?
Uh,
I haven't read it.
Okay, well, I've read bits of it.
I've only read about 12 or 15.
I don't even read what I write, let alone what other people write.
Well, I haven't read my own. So why don't you go ahead, Andrew?
I've read bits of it. So, I mean, one's impression is there's a lot of stuff in there. There's some essays I haven't got around to reading yet, which I do want to read, the Martin Rees one, for example, because I think one of the other things that's interesting about the book is that the editor, John Schroeter, has brought together people who aren't necessarily futurists, but are interested in the future. Obviously Martin Rees, who's the former British astronomer royal, set up the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk in the UK, which is obviously a kind of classic sort of futurist concern. Haven't read that essay yet, but I'm looking forward to getting around to it. There's an awful lot in it. I read Ray Kurzweil's essay because it's plastered all over the back, and I kind of felt that he probably just used it as a chance to say the same things he's been saying for quite a long time, which was possibly a little bit depressing. I've worked with Maggie Grayson in the past, and she has a very nice essay actually immediately following yours, Jerry, where she talks about design futures and creating what she calls enclaves of the future through design, which kind of felt like it was in the spirit of future shock and adaptive change, so I like that essay.
Well, okay. Well, I'll tell you guys which one that caught me. One by another one of our APF colleagues who has been on Seeking Delphi, Joe Tankersley, stating how important he thinks imagination is in dealing with the future and the potential of future shock and imagining how things can be better. He wrote a not very optimistic book, but realistically optimistic on how things could be better. And of course, he's a Disney Imagineer, but I have a story that I recounted when I did my web panel on scenarios for a post-aging future that I think is illustrative of this. I was in an adult night school class back in the 80s. A friend of mine had been teaching this course in applied creativity and it was bugging me, take the course. So I finally took it. In the first class, we had an assignment, write your own obituary. All right. Imagine the rest of your life and what your obituary will be. Well, I was horrified by the things the other people wrote in regards to longevity, because here were healthy, affluent, educated people in their 30s and 40s, and they all imagined themselves dying in their 60s and 70s. I actually pegged my death at 110. They just couldn't imagine a different future, not even the same future. They were using life expectancy at birth numbers, not remaining life expectancy for affluent, educated, healthy people at that stage of life. And I was struck by the lack of imagination. I said, these are people that really need to learn applied creativity. So I think Joe's observation that imagination is really, really important, that we have to be able to imagine different futures to not be blindsided by them. So if either you guys have a further comment, I'll see if we have a question or two from anybody before we wrap this up. So I see like Robert has one more question, and can you guys hang for about 2 more minutes? We'll let Robert ask one more question.
Yeah.
Is there so if you look at, let's say, futurists like Vinay Gupta, he used the term, like futurism can be both for, for setting up good, positive futures we want, but also, preventing disastrous futures. And, he talks about it in very kind of polemic terms of like, there are future better states and there are horrible hells we could go towards if we don't do this kind of work. But are there trends about where you see what kind of people dealing with this, or is it a scale issue where, when you're dealing with an industry organization, they just want an individual better future, but as you get to larger, more like governmental, then it becomes kind of disaster prevention? I'm trying to get a sense of, when are we steering more towards one or the other? When does the tone become, build the positive or avoid the negative?
Well, I always end up thinking of three horizons here, Robert, and I think, if the risk people are people who are looking at what the current system is doing and how it might go wrong, and that's the dominant system. So they tend to be more at the kind of avoiding disasters, and the more the kind of horizon 3 people. So they're the managers, if you like, the maintainers of the present system. The people who are looking for the preferred future and how can we sort of look at creating agency towards change, they tend to be more visionary or entrepreneurial. So I think there tends to be a bit of a mindset thing, but it's also about where you are in the system. But yeah, Vinay Gupta, I'm a huge fan of Vinay Gupta. I once saw him talking to a meeting of mostly security and defense people. And his going in position was, and I was sitting at the back of the room, his going in position was saying to these guys, if you're not thinking about disasters that involve 1 million deaths, you're not taking your job seriously. And you could, you could feel the ripple in the room. And I was sitting behind a guy who was, I think he was associated on a attachment at the Pentagon at the time. And I heard him sort of say out loud, where did they find this fruit case, where did they find this fruit case? Because, this kind of idea of thinking of an extreme future so you could actually mitigate was actually so shocking to them. And interestingly, I mentioned Martin Rees earlier. I think he still has a long bet out, which is that there'll be at least 1 million deaths in an event caused by bioterror or bioerror by the end of this year. So again, that's again a management.
We have a coronavirus, and we'll see what happens with that, right?
Well, I think the bet runs out this year. So I mean, he's probably not keeping his fingers crossed, but it suddenly looks like it might be a live, it might be a live scenario again.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone. We will conclude this web panel now. This video will be on YouTube within the next 24 hours, and then the podcast, the audio podcast, should be up by the weekend. So I'd like to thank Andrew Curry and Jerome Glenn, and a shout out to Cindy Fruin. Unfortunately, wasn't able to be here at the last minute, but I know she's and her family are in our thoughts, and I know she'll appreciate this program. So thank you, and we are done.